player, having kind of caught up to Kodak in terms of brand, in terms of distribution, in terms of quality of the patents and the knowledge. And so 1973 marked the unfolding of some events that would fundamentally change the trajectory for these two companies. That was the year that the Hunt brothers, very famous oil and gas billionaires from Texas, right, began to try to hedge their positions in this industry by buying up silver. They were making an effort to actually corner the world's market in silver, and they did this kind of quietly throughout the 70s. And they bought silver and bought silver and bought silver, and by the time the plot came to light in 1979, the price of this very precious raw material had skyrocketed. What was worse than that, from the perspective of the chemical-based photography business, was that the availability of silver was coming into question. The Hunt brothers reportedly controlled about half the world's supply. And so what followed was 3 or 4 months of hysteria, basically. Everybody running around with their hair on fire saying, oh my God, the world is falling. Well, the plot fell apart, the Hunt brothers went bankrupt, and all the photography company executives, except for one, said, thank God that's over. Back to business as usual. Does that phrase sound a little familiar? We kind of like to go back to business as usual, and most of the photography companies did. The one guy that didn't was a guy named Minoru Onishi. He was fairly new in his role as CEO of Fujifilm at the time, and this experience really rattled him and shook him up. And he said, wow, 2 things that bear in my mind. One, if it happened once, it can happen again. Why do we think we're immune to this? So it kind of set him off course a little bit. But the second one that I thought was quite a profound question, and very profound for your industry. How did we miss this? How did this sort of existential threat to our industry, which, by the way, built up over 7 years, why were we not paying attention? How did we get caught by surprise? Now, his resolve to do something about this crystallized in 1984, when Sony introduced the very first consumer-facing digital camera, ironically using technology that had been invented at Kodak, to the market, 1984. And at that moment, Onishi said, that's it. We've got to start our transformation journey now. And he began by looking at what is the fundamental essence of what we're good at Fuji. And it turns out to be in the photography business, you have to be really good at surfactant technology. And he started to think about where else could we use surfactant technology. And he began to pull resources out of the chemical business, and he got them into new industries. He got them into LED processing. They're a big player supplied to the television industry these days. He got them into cosmetics, because it turns out surfaces are pretty important in cosmetics. Today, you find Fuji in healthcare, you find them in office workflow processing, and of course, they're still in photography, but as a percentage of their business, their classic photography business is about 1% of revenue. Today, Fuji employs over 80,000 people. Their revenues last year were on the order of 25 billion US. They're number 497 on Fortune's list of the largest 1,000 global companies. They're healthy. They're doing very well. They've completely transformed their core business. Kodak, a shadow of its former self, crawling out of bankruptcy, literally blowing up its factories because it can't afford to pay the real estate taxes on them. And it's very sad for me because I grew up in Rochester. A lot of my associations are with that fabulous Kodak brand. Now, why do I think this is a story particularly appropriate for this conference? Look at the patterns, right? A hugely successful, very sophisticated, very talent-intensive, knowledge-intensive business, which had a competitive business model that didn't change for probably 65 years. And the margins were fantastic. As a friend of mine says, you know the trouble with Kodak? Nostalgia as business strategy. You really want to watch out for that because over time, that's not what's going to carry you forward. So I always think about it when I think about firms that have fantastic margins for a long time and a business model that's really easy to defend because there are huge barriers to entry. And that's kind of been the case here. So be thinking about that. If you were the CEO of Kodak, if you were the CEO of Fuji, what were some things you might be And in particular, here's the thing to ask yourself. What's the silver in our business? What would our early mornings be? And are we facing them honestly, or are we kind of shrugging them off? I hear this a lot in the companies I work with. Oh, this is just a cyclical thing. It'll be back to normal pretty soon. You have to really think about that. If you look at this chart, which shows the price of silver, that price of silver at that time was indeed an anomaly. But it set in place the changes that Fuji felt they had the courage they have to make. So when are things most dangerous? Do you recognize this fact? Some of you probably will. I do a lot of work in Finland, actually, of all places, which is kind of unusual. And this is a front page magazine headline of a guy named Olli-Pekka Kalasvuo, who is the former CEO of a company I still very much admire, Nokia. So here it is, November of 2007. The iPhone has been released just shy of 6 months earlier than the date this issue appeared. And look at the headline, right? Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the cell phone king? Well, it turns out the answer was yes. And I'm not here to poke fun at Nokia, a company I deeply admire, or Olli-Pekka, who's a guy who thought he did as good a job as he knew how to do. Here's the dilemma. When you're on the front page of the newspaper, and you can do no wrong, and everybody's telling you how great you are, it's kind of hard to think that might all go poof, very quickly. And so I think this is a very human dilemma, and I'm not here to criticize anybody or poke fun at anybody, but I think it can be seductive. You can get yourself lulled into a sense of, wow, this is never going to change. So here's a classic pattern that I'd like you to just think about. This is the share of total market occupied by various platforms in the gaming business. And what matters here is the pattern. So in the beginning, we have arcade games, right? And you had to physically go to an arcade and play the one game on the one machine that did that game. You didn't switch games around. Then that shifted to games played on consoles. So Nintendo had their dedicated console and Sony had theirs and so forth. Then you moved to a model of shrink-wrapped games that could be played on a general-purpose console, like a PC. And you could actually play different games using the same hardware, which was kind of advanced. And now we've got games played on mobile devices, we've got games played inside other people's games, we've got games played inside things like Facebook. Ever unfriended anybody because they asked you to buy like bales of hay from Farmville or something? You'll know what I mean. Now, what matters about this is, the pattern, right? What we see is this very clear pattern. Something is initiated, it takes off, it has this period of time where you get to really enjoy the fruits of the work, and then things change. Technology changes, competitors catch up, tastes change, people move on, and it goes into erosion. And it happens a lot, and you can see a similar pattern playing out over many, many industries. And so the question is, how do we ensure, as the leaders of our organizations, that we are able to do this kind of inside? Because what we want is to create waves of competitive advantages when we're in a transient advantage economy. So one of the first things that is really different is today we're used to thinking of things in terms of industry. So what's your industry? And you can answer very confidently, the oil and gas industry. But oftentimes the most significant competition you face is not from others within your industry necessarily, but it's other industries coming in and taking something you need. Talented employees, share of market, share of mind, disposable income. So, the iPhone and similar technologies, sponsored by Android, have had the effect of shifting household spending away from apparel and automotive and travel and restaurants to spending on internet and telecommunications. So in a way, even if you're a clothing company, you're competing with this other technology. And I think it's very important to bear that in mind. Now, I'm not saying they're intentional competitors. Apple did not create the iPhone with the concept that they were going to put Rand McNally out of business. That was not their intention. They're just kind of collateral damage in someone else's strategy. This is just the same chart, same information in chart form. And the thing to look at is those two bottom blue bars, which shows the shift in American household spending from 2007, the year the iPhone was introduced, to 2013, when the Bloom Journal did this study. And the bottom two bars, the most growth in any sector that they tracked were cell phones and internet spending of various kinds. So again, you have to be thinking about these oblique competitive forces that could cause what you do to be irrelevant or less attractive. So I think it's important to be thinking about that. So I've developed what I call a new playbook for strategy, a way of starting to say, what do we need to do differently in a world that looks like this? What are the things we need to change? So the first thing is what I call continuous reconfiguration. And what does that mean? We used to think that stability was the normal thing, and change was the weird thing. In fact, if you look up change management under friendly local search engine, you will get something like 2.1 references, like instantly. Because we focus so much on how hard it is to change. Well, I would argue the reason it's so hard to change is we didn't do it enough along the way. And therefore, when we do try to change, we've got all these inertial forces to combat. Whereas the firms in my research that have been quite successful at navigating these kind of highly uncertain environments, what you see them doing is changing a lot over time, but not changing a lot at any one time. It's continual small changes that refresh their business model, that sort of adjust their organizational structure, that teach their people about new parts of the business, that cause them to kind of work in a much more fluid way. A great example of this is a little company called FactSet. They started in the 70s literally as the FactSet, a phone book sized paper book full of numbers that they sell to other financial service companies. Today, unrecognizable. I mean, they're in the cloud, they're in very sophisticated big data analytics, they're offering all kinds of things. But if you look at their history from the 70s to today, you do not see one major downsizing. You do not see one major acquisition. You see a lot of bolt-on, small acquisitions. You don't see one big one. And you don't see the kind of fire the left-hand side of the building stuff that happens to companies that haven't changed in a long time in response to a changing environment. So be thinking, continuous, small reconfiguration, continuous adjustment that gets you out of the need to have these big wrenching ones. So that's the first thing. Second thing, healthy disengagement. What does that mean? Well, by the time an advantage has gone into erosion, you need to be able to extract resources from that and put them into something that's new and innovative. So, common sense, right? You need to be able to disengage from something that's exhausted and reinvest in something that's up and coming. Most companies find this to be brutally difficult. Why? Friendship ties have emerged, and cutting down that business means cutting down that person. And in other words, disengagement happens. It happens a lot, but it happens in a very painful and wasteful almost way. Instead, what you want to be thinking about is, let's put an end-of-life date on parts of our business. Let's monitor them, and when end-of-life comes, let's plan for it in a healthy way. Let's make sure we keep the people who have talent that we want to preserve. Let's make sure we don't lose critical capabilities that may be worthwhile somewhere else in the business. But let's also make the decision that it's time to exit. And I think that's really valuable to think about. DuPont is going through this right now in getting rid of their slower growing traditional chemicals businesses. And it's painful, but they're doing it in a very, careful and intelligent way. So healthy disengagement, kind of important. The third one is almost existential, and this is what I call deft resource allocation. What does that mean? That means separating the power in your company from the ability to decide where resources go in your company. So let's do a little thought experiment on this one. And imagine to yourself that you are the CEO of Sony Walkman's division. And for 35 years, that division has been the leader in its category, right? The portable music phone. Nobody has caught up to Sony. And what got you where you are, right? AA batteries and little whirring machines that take content off of media in album form and replicate them with incredible precision so you can carry your music around in a portable fashion. And that's got you where you are. So let's say you've been listening to some Columbia professor talk and you think, gee, I really ought to look into the future. What might that be? You call up some people from R&D and you say, tell me about the future. And with some nervousness, they look at you and they say, well, okay, the future, no more AA batteries. No more worrying gizmos. In fact, no more media, no more albums. It's all going to be songs. And they're going to fly through the air and land on your hard drive. Oh, and the quality of the music that's reproduced is going to be worse than what we can do today. That's the future. So what do you do if you're that manager, right? You say politely, since you're Japanese, you say politely, thank you very much, please go back to R&D where you can do minimal damage, right? Now, I'm telling this story in a funny way, but that is not that far from what actually happened at Sony. There was an article written about this. It was called The Civil War Inside Sony. Powerful people did not want to give up people, the assets, the resources under their control to position Sony for a future which was going to be quite different than the one that they were used to. And this happens a lot in companies. When a business is under threat, when you're feeling concerned, then the logical and most immediate response is to defend. And that usually takes two forms. One is we try to shape the business into what we think it needs to be competitive at whatever the new environment is. And we also invest a lot of money in sort of defensive maneuvers, increasing some kinds of spending. Instead of saying, wait a minute, maybe we need to be prepared to shrink this a bit and take those resources and move them somewhere else. And this happens in many ways. Lego, famous company, right? They're brilliant at it. Their CEO insists every division gives up a certain amount of profit, goes into a central pot, and then they as a team look at where it gets reinvested. So that's a good best practice. And it's another way of keeping the organization from getting too stable, too unchanged. Fourth thing, innovation as a proficiency. Now, innovation happens all the time. We all talk about it, right? But a lot of times doing it is a lot harder than saying you're doing it. And when you look at what companies actually call innovation, a lot of times it's not that innovative. It's something that they kind of have to do to keep up with what others are doing in their own core business. Or it's something that's maybe an incremental step away. But real innovation, to me, in the future, remember, what we're after here is organizations that can produce waves of competitive advantage, not just do it once or twice. You need to build it as a proficiency. In a lot of companies, it's the function of one person's personality, right? So the big senior manager gets up and says, we need more innovation around here. You go form a skunk works, right? Or the one I love is when everybody has to go to innovation boot camp, because I'm kind of in that business, so we fill our classrooms at Columbia with people with Post-it notes, and everybody's going to do innovation boot camp and come up with great ideas. And here's the thing, people think it's the ideas that are the problem, and I promise you they're not. If I did an ideation session with you guys right here today, you'd have more ideas than any of your companies could implement in the next 50 years. The problem is innovation is actually three things. It's getting the ideas, definitely. Then it's incubation, and that's where things start to get tough. Because it's taking the idea and piloting and experimenting and prototyping and turning it into a business. So going from a very uncertain high assumption to knowledge ratio situation into an actual business is hard. Even harder. To make it substantial and to make it important to your organization, to get it big enough, you have to practice what I call acceleration. So you can think of your core business as a 6-lane highway, and this little business has to come up the ramp and join it. Because if you don't have a way of accelerating, it's going to get squashed. And that happens a lot. So ideation, incubation, acceleration as a proficiency, not depending on one person, not depending on the flavor of the month, not depending on do we have budget this week or not, and a dedicated resource to pursue it. A phrase that I encourage you to think about as you're reflecting on your own organizations is something Lou Gerstner said in the dark days of IBM's sort of struggles to reinvigorate itself. He said, good companies put their best talent on problems. Great companies put their best talent on opportunities. So if I were to give you a little exercise to do, when next time you're sort of looking at your talent situation in your organizations, Haul out your list of your top, say, 15 to 20 strategic priorities. Haul out your list of your top 20% talents and ask yourself, is there a correlation between those two? Are we putting our best, most capable people on our top future priorities? Or are they sort of constantly getting yanked into crisis mode and problem solving? It's a really good question to think about. Leadership. In the past, good leaders were rewarded and managers were promoted for predicting what would happen and making sure that those predictions came true. And in a relatively stable environment, that's not a bad thing at all. However, when the environment is constantly giving you new information, as a leader, you need to be able to hear it, accept it, and act on it. And so what we're looking at is a really new set of requirements for leaders in terms of being able to even take in the information. And then as senior executives, it gets very easy to get isolated. It gets very hard to hear what's actually going on. And your ability to connect with real sources of data is often not very good because you're so buffered by other people. And also, your rank makes it hard for people to tell you unpleasant things. I have a friend who's a CEO, just recently got made a CEO, and he said, I asked him how it was going. He said, it's fantastic. My decisions are smarter. My jokes are funnier. I think I'm even taller. It's great. I love it. So there was a great story in one of our newspapers, I think 2 weeks ago. You may know of Target, they're one of our big retailers. And the new CEO of Target has completely freaked his organization out. Midway through a business trip, he made an unplanned visit to an actual Target store and didn't tell anybody he was coming. The whole management was like in a shock. Because previously, the previous guy, his visits were orchestrated like state, enterprises. I mean, it was, as a reporter put it, and wrote about this, everything was there, a band playing Hail to the Chief. Now, what kind of unvarnished information are you going to get from a visit like that? So I think leaders are going to have to be more open to information, more willing to hear. Sometimes people are going to say things that aren't too pleasant to hear, and you need to be sort of steeling yourself to hear that and accept it, if you think there's some validity into it, or at least look into it. The worst thing to do is to go into denial. Back to Kodak again, 1984. The reason I know about this is my dad was a Kodak employee. 1984, Fortune posted this huge long story on, I think it was Kodak and Procter & Gamble, who was also in trouble at the time, and they say, have these companies lost their global competitiveness? This is 1984. And you know what Kodak did to respond to this? They published a 50-page rebuttal, line by line, of this Fortune article. And it was things like, Kodak has not gained its technological edge. And the rebuttal was something like, Kodak has indeed not lost its technological edge. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But they didn't want to hear it. They don't tell us. Okay. So leadership, critically important. Lastly, and this really matters to your talent. In a more stable world, careers are often managed by the company, and people's expectations of how they would spend their time at work was kind of, you'd spend your first 2 years worshiping the office copy machine, and then you'd be given a little bit of responsibility, and eventually you kind of work your way up from a level 22 to a level 4, and that was nirvana, right? And our millennials don't think that way at all. They have been taught, often by our organizations, that organizations are not loyal, organizations will not necessarily reward them, and they're on their own as far as building valuable skills and making sure that they are employable to somebody in the future. I call it having a much more entrepreneurial view of career management. As Time magazine put it, you raised them, now you have to manage them. And they have very different expectations from employers than certainly I did when I first started working. Their expectations are, I need to be more valuable after 2 years or 3 years or 4 years with you than I am when I joined. And that's a tough challenge to meet. When you've got to have a job to be done. And in your categories, in your industry, dare I say, you need people who are willing to do something for a long time to develop that deep expertise. So how do you do that when their expectations are they're moving on every 2 years? There's some really interesting challenge these things flag up for us. So those are some elements of what I call the new playbook for strategy. So from stability as the normal thing to continuous reconfiguration, from disengagement being relatively rare and managed sort of haphazardly to being managed in a healthy way, from resource allocation being sort of handled by the powerful people in the company to resource allocation that looks at the whole portfolio and makes portfolio level decisions about where resources have to go, from innovation being kind of on again, off again, on again, off again, to being a real organizational efficiency, from leaders who sort of stick to plan to leaders who are willing to take in new information and adjust accordingly, from sort of company managed career ladders to what some people call the tour of duty economy, tour of duty job. There's this wonderful story on the subject of leadership that I love to tell about Alan Mulally, who is an acquaintance of mine, I wouldn't say friend, but an acquaintance of mine. And of course, he's very famously the former CEO of Ford. He was persuaded to join Ford, came over from Boeing, and first day on the job, and Ford is in trouble. Ford is in deep, dark trouble, which they have created for themselves. And it was a very badly off situation in Ford. So he pulls into the executive parking garage in the Ford Motor Company, where all the important people park their cars, and looks around and beholds no Ford branded cars in the executive parking garage of the Ford Motor Company. I mean, we're not even talking a weak signal. It's not good. So Mulally has this very famous management system. He calls it the meeting business plan, and every week he has an all hands on deck, all senior executives, and then later on some visitors and things. But it began with just all the senior executives with all their data for the week, how they did for the week, around the table. And of course, when he first proposed this, the executives were all like, no, we're much too busy. I'm in China, I'm here, I'm there, I should be out meeting with customers. I can't come to your meeting, and besides that, my calendar's full. So Mulally instructed everybody to cancel all the meetings and said the only meeting you need to go to that's an internal meeting, not external, an internal meeting is mine once a week. And so they complained, and he said, look, it's fine, I mean, it's okay. You can't be a senior executive at the Ford Motor Company if you don't come to my meeting, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person. He's Kansan, but he's tough. So the way they did it at Ford was every performance indicator that they measured was color-coded. So green meant good, go. Yellow meant, some issues, maybe we should take a closer look. Red, like stop, oh, bad. So Mulally had just come out of a meeting with the CFO of the whole company and learned, much to his dismay, the company was solidly on track to lose 16 point something, close to $17 billion that year. That year was 2006. They were months away from going broke. So he comes into his first meeting. Everybody's got their performance numbers in front of them, and it's all green. And he looks at them and he's like, guys, are we on plan to lose $17 billion? Is that what you're telling me? This can't be true. And he said something that I think should be sort of etched in the hearts of every company leader. He said, you can't manage a secret. If we can get the data out there, and we can really be honest about what our issues are, we can fix it. We have the talent in this company to fix it, but not if we don't know it's there. And he told me afterwards, he said, reds are gifts. They are opportunities to crack a problem and make real progress. But we can't do it if we don't know it's there. Now, the culture at Ford before he got there was one of those corporate cultures where you didn't admit your problems. You kind of hoped you could fix it on your own before anybody else noticed. And your purpose of going to a meeting was to sort of gotcha the guy next to you so that you knew better than the other guy. It was not at all about cooperating as a company. And Mulally said, good stop on it. It's going to be one Ford, and we're all going to help each other. So about the third meeting or so in, Mike Fields is currently the CEO. He took over when Mulally retired this summer. So he says, all right, pushes his pictures away from him. He says, I'm red on Edge. Edge being the small SUV that Ford was counting on as part of their new product lineup. Now what Mulally does in the next 3 seconds is going to determine whether his leadership there is going to succeed or not. So what did he do? He stood up. That's what we need. Okay, the rest of you. You've all had long experience in this company. Let's stop the meeting. We're going to focus on Mike's problem. We're going to see if we can find a solution. And what was amazing was, yes, around that table, they had people who could loan in engineers, They had somebody with a similar problem 2 years before. They had somebody who had a little slack resource that could shift into that budget. They started to work as a team. 2 years later, in 2008, when the auto company executives made the rather ill-advised decision to fly their corporate jets to Washington to look for a bailout, Malala went along. But by then, Ford was $1 billion in the clear. They had $1 billion in the bank. They had gotten rid of the debt. They had released a really exciting new line of cars. And ironically, this visit to Washington, when Ford made it very clear they were not in trouble, sort of convinced a huge percentage of the American population to take a second look at Ford that hadn't driven a Ford in years. And Malala was telling me later, if somebody told me that getting hauled over the coals in Washington by a bunch of senators would be a great marketing effort, I would have laughed in their face. But so it wasn't, and a remarkable story. But take away with you can't manage a secret, because it requires a different way of working if you're going to be effective in these very dynamic environments. So we need to go from the assumption of stability to the assumption of change. From reinforcing each other's perspectives like some kind of giant echo chamber to challenging the status quo. From being precise but slow to being fast and hopefully right in a lot of places. From being internally focused to being externally focused. And from accepting a slow failing trajectory to picking oneself up kind of quickly. This chart just illustrates the point that, yeah, he's really on a little faster. It took 19 quarters for America Online to penetrate 20 million American households. It took 9 quarters for Apple's iOS to penetrate 60 million households. Pretty remarkable change. I talked about individuals and talent. What we're going from is this world of organizational systems and hierarchies and performance reviews toward what some people call the tour of duty economy, where you sign up for something, you see that thing through, and then you go back into the talent pool and maybe sign up for something else. It's a really different way of thinking about careers, and it puts huge emphasis on your HR talent. You really need strong people figuring this out for your company. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more organizations almost organized like the way they make movies, or put on political campaigns, or run the Olympics, where you bring the relevant players together to accomplish something, and then they move on. So at this juncture, you're probably wondering, is there any good news in this at all? Yes, I think there really is. Once we let go of these notions that we've got to sort of cling on to an advantage and defend it to the bitter end, you start to see opportunity. You start to see opportunity in innovation, you start to see opportunity in being entrepreneurial, and in your industry, which has so much talent and so much capability, I bet you're going to see an unending horizon of opportunities. Thank you very much.